Roberto Carlos, the left foot that changed football. There are some footballers you remember because of the trophies they won. Some because of the clubs they played for. And then there are players you remember because, for a few seconds, they made the impossible look normal. Roberto Carlos was that kind of player. When you think about Brazilian football, you think about creativity, passion, rhythm, and freedom. But Roberto Carlos brought something different. He brought power. He brought courage. And most importantly, he brought a left foot that seemed to have a life of its own. But behind that famous smile, the powerful legs, and those unbelievable free kicks was a boy who came from humble beginnings and had to fight his way toward a dream. Roberto Carlos da Silva Rocha was born on April 10, 1973, in Garca, São Paulo, Brazil. He grew up in a working-class family, and like millions of Brazilian children, football wasn't just a game to him. It was a way of life. As a kid, Roberto Carlos didn't have everything. He wasn't born into fame or wealth. He had to work hard, and he understood from an early age that talent alone wasn't enough. He had to earn his opportunity. His professional journey began in Brazil, where he played for União São João before making a move to Palmeiras. That move changed everything. At Palmeiras, people began noticing something special. Roberto Carlos wasn't a traditional defender. He was fast. He was aggressive. He attacked like a winger. And when he struck the ball, it sounded different. His left foot could send the ball flying with unbelievable speed, and his willingness to run forward made him one of the most exciting defenders in Brazilian football. Soon, Europe came calling. In 1995, Roberto Carlos moved to Inter Milan. For a young Brazilian player, this was supposed to be the beginning of a dream. But football can be strange. Sometimes, even when you're talented, the right situation doesn't come at the right time. Roberto Carlos didn't stay at Inter for long. And then came the move that would define his career. Real Madrid. In 1996, Roberto Carlos joined one of the biggest clubs in the world. At first, nobody could have known just how important he would become. But it didn't take long. He became a superstar. At Real Madrid, Roberto Carlos became much more than a defender. He became an entertainer. He could sprint down the left side of the field, beat defenders, deliver dangerous crosses, and then suddenly unleash one of those shots that looked almost impossible to stop. But there is one moment that turned his name into football legend. A free kick against France in 1997. The distance was huge. The angle looked impossible. Even the goalkeeper, Fabian Barthez, seemed prepared for a normal shot. Roberto Carlos stepped up. He struck the ball with the outside of his left foot. And then something incredible happened. The ball appeared to be heading wide. Then it curved, and somehow found its way into the net. It wasn't just a goal. It was a moment that made people question physics. Fans around the world watched the replay again and again, trying to understand how he had done it. But Roberto Carlos wasn't finished. At Real Madrid, he became part of one of the greatest teams of his generation. He shared the dressing room with legends. Players like Zinedine Zidane, Ronaldo Nazario, Luis Figo, Raúl, and many others. Together, they created a team that became known around the world as the Galacticos. And Roberto Carlos was one of the most important pieces. He won multiple La Liga titles. He won the UEFA Champions League. He lifted trophies that millions of footballers dream about but never get close to touching. Yet what made Roberto Carlos special wasn't only what he won. It was the way he played. He played with personality. He played without fear. He never looked like he was trying to be someone else. He was simply Roberto Carlos. For Brazil, his story became even bigger. Wearing the famous yellow jersey, he represented a country where football is almost a religion. He played alongside Ronaldo, Rivaldo, Cafu, Ronaldinho, and other Brazilian legends. And in 2002, everything came together. Brazil entered the World Cup with enormous expectations. Roberto Carlos was part of the team. Match after match, Brazil moved forward. Then came the final against Germany. Brazil won 2-0. Ronaldo scored both goals, and Roberto Carlos became a World Cup champion. Think about that for a moment. The boy from Brazil who had started with humble beginnings was now standing on the biggest stage in football, holding the most famous trophy in the sport. That is what dreams can look like when you refuse to give up. But Roberto Carlos' career wasn't perfect. There were difficult moments. There were mistakes. There were injuries. There were moments when people questioned him. And eventually, every footballer has to face something they don't want to think about. Time. The legs become slower. The body takes longer to recover. The stadiums that once screamed your name begin to move on to the next generation. For Roberto Carlos, the end of his playing career eventually arrived. But his legacy didn't disappear. Because some players leave behind statistics. Others leave behind memories. Roberto Carlos left behind both. He inspired an entire generation of young defenders to believe that a fullback didn't have to stay in the background. A defender could attack. A defender could score. A defender could become a superstar. And perhaps most importantly, Roberto Carlos showed that being different could become your greatest strength. His famous free kicks are still replayed. His runs down the left wing are still remembered. His smile is still recognizable. And his name remains connected to one of the most unforgettable eras in football history. But when I look at Roberto Carlos' story, I don't just see the powerful left foot. I see the journey. I see a young Brazilian boy with a dream. I see someone who had to work for his opportunities. I see someone who traveled across continents to prove himself. I see someone who stepped onto the biggest stages in the world and refused to be afraid. And that's what makes his story so emotional. Because Roberto Carlos didn't become a legend overnight. He built that legacy one game, one run, one tackle, and one unbelievable strike at a time. Football eventually moves on. New stars arrive. New records are broken. New heroes are created. But there are certain players who become part of the history of the game itself. Roberto Carlos is one of them. His left foot could bend a football around a wall. His legs could carry him from defense to attack in seconds. But his greatest achievement wasn't the power of his shot. It was the power of his journey. From humble beginnings in Brazil to the greatest stadiums in the world, Roberto Carlos turned a dream into reality. And maybe that's why, years later, when we see that famous free kick flying through the air, we don't just watch a goal. We watch history. We watch imagination. We watch a reminder that sometimes, the impossible only looks impossible until somebody is brave enough to try. And Roberto Carlos was always brave enough to try. That is why his name will never simply belong to the past. It belongs to football, forever.